improved cooking stoves for low-income populations. So this slide just expresses what the overall research question is that drives this low-income energy platform. And so really what we're looking at is, because there have been a lot of studies about, well, can you implement certain technologies in poor countries, and can you make a distributed solar panel work? Can you make mini hydro work? And as an engineer, I know that the answer to any question like that is always yes. From an engineering perspective, you can make any technology work anywhere. The question that becomes more relevant for making an impact is, can you make it work sustainably? Can you create an institutional arrangement that will recover costs, that will provide for maintenance of these energy technologies, that something that will keep working many years after it's put in? And that turns out to be the much more difficult question, and that's the fundamental question that we approach in this research area. And we use a variety of methods, including structured case studies and also more quantitative methods. Just a little bit of background to start on why this problem matters. Well, first of all, it matters because it's a very large problem. So it affects around 1.5 billion people around the world have no access to electricity, and the figure is around 2.5 billion that have no access to quote unquote modern fuels. And so these are people who are cooking with collected firewood or dung or other available energy sources. But as we'll see, those energy sources have some significant downsides. So this is just a list of a couple of the big problems about the status quo for large parts of the world. So one thing is that energy is intimately tied up with development outcomes. So if you don't have lighting in houses and schools, this can impede education. Kids can't do their homework. It also impedes economic development. That small businesses that people might want to develop may depend on energy inputs. It can be an issue just from the time burden that it imposes, especially on women in poor areas, to go out and collect wood for a number of hours per day rather than doing other things. And then more recently, the climate impacts, especially on the fuel side, have gotten a lot more attention in recent years. It turns out that cooking with traditional methods and just collected wood has an outsized climate contribution, because it creates a lot of soot and a lot of incomplete products of combustion that have very high global warming impacts. And then the most significant, I think, consequence of, at least on the fuel side, is a health impact. And so I'll talk about that in the next slide. And this is something people have known about and been worried about and tried to do things about for decades, which is the indoor air pollution that you see on the left from traditional firewood stoves that are indoors. And so it's estimated in epidemiological studies that this is kind of on par with malaria as a public health impact, and some studies say it's worse. So the idea is, if you see on the right that this woman, rather than a traditional stove, she has an LPG stove. So that's the red cylinder up there, liquefied petroleum gases. And then the stove is just to the left of that. And then there's also another stove, which I'll talk more about, which is that this is an improved biomass stove. So it's a way of burning available biomass more cleanly. So the thinking goes, if you can have, at large scale, people transition over to these improved stoves, you can really make a difference in health globally. Now, this has been attacked for a number of years, mainly by governments. Many governments around the world have tried to get people to use cleaner stoves, mostly unsuccessfully, although China is an exception, that China had a relatively successful program. And many nonprofits have been very worried about that and have developed fancy stove technologies and then tried to get people to use them. But one issue that comes up is, well, do the people who are the customers for these stoves value the same kinds of things that we as outsiders think they should value? So, we think that, well, gosh, this indoor smoke, I mean, it's terrible. You've got to stop using these stoves. But that's a question. Well, how high up do those kinds of concerns rate on the objective functions of developing country consumers? And I just show some very initial results of a study that I'm working on with Grant Miller in the Center for Health Policy. And this was beyond just cook stoves. This was looking at health improving technologies among low income populations. And so this is actually a meta study where it looked through the medical literature it was actually from an initial sample of 1,000 studies, and looked through and characterized, well, what did those studies say about the factors that drive adoption? And so the largest number of papers were on insecticide-treated bed nets, and that's in the upper left. And there are also some on water sanitation, and in this particular sample, a relatively small number in the medical literature on health impacts of cook stoves. And so what you can see in these studies, so the length of this gray bar is indicating how many times, how many studies cited a factor as a significant reason why people were adopting things. And so what you see is, health for the ITNs and the water sanitation, health is up there as a reason. But a much bigger reason is comfort and convenience related factors. So for example, with bed nets, that translates into people are more likely to make a switch to an anti-malaria bed net because it keeps out the mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes are uncomfortable to sleep with at night, versus doing it explicitly for health benefits for themselves and their family, although health does figure. I think it's likely that the picture in cook stoves from other literatures is even worse in this respect. And I'll talk about this in the next slide. So really a challenge with thinking about these kinds of technologies in low-income countries is that there are a couple obstacles to people using them. And different technologies can be very, very different because they have different combinations of these sort of obstacles to adoption. And so I'm not going to, this is very, very complex, and I'm not going to go through the details, but broadly, it talks about three principal obstacles to adoption of different kinds of technologies. The first, and most important on the left, is just the inherent perceived value by the consumer population for that kind of technology. The middle one is the relative affordability of the technology. And the one on the right is the level of lifestyle change that it involves to adopt it. And so you can get technologies that sort themselves along this whole continuum based on, well, how many of these obstacles do they really present? And the thing that I would note is cook stoves are among the most challenging because many people don't perceive any inherent value relative to their traditional cooking methods. They're relatively expensive, and because cooking is so fundamental to lifestyle, they imply a big lifestyle change. So anyway, this is just a device that we came up with for sort of sorting through different technologies from a diffusion perspective. So now I'm going to talk a little about some of our current research on cook stoves, and we've approached this from both the top-down and the bottom-up sides of things. The top-down is really looking from a business model perspective as a company or even a government or a nonprofit. What kinds of factors about how you try to disseminate these stoves affect whether people use them? And then the other approach, which I'll talk about second, is bottom-up. What are factors about people's cooking habits and demographics, and what kinds of things at the household level make people use or not use these kinds of technologies? So starting with the top-down approach, I'm just going to summarize a piece of some recent research that we did that was published in Energy Policy. So what we did is we took an initial sample of 14 companies that are trying to sell stoves in India. And we whittled this down to about 9 or 10 that were directly relevant for what we were looking at. And as you see here, there's quite a wide variation. Some of these have been in business for a number of years. Some are quite new. Some are just a couple people. Some are pretty large operations. And then, especially, there's been very wide variation in how many stoves these places have actually sold. And so over the course of the summer in 2010, we did a series of interviews with the heads of these different companies and looked at specific business model factors and how their own company was coming down on these factors, and then looking at their outcomes so far. And so one of these outcomes, of course, is their ability to scale. Have they been able to sell a lot of stoves? But another thing that's equally important, again, is how sustainably can this be done? Is this a business where it can recover costs and make enough money to keep going? Or is this sort of a flash in the pan that makes a brief impact but then dies? So with the limited time here, I'm going to focus on some direct comparisons between two of the companies that actually did scale to a reasonable extent. So the first one is First Energy, and this was formerly part of BP. It was the emerging consumer markets division of BP to sell these stoves in India. And so with BP's kind of capital behind it and resources devoted to research in this area, they sold a lot of stoves, but they're also facing some very significant problems now in really sustaining this business now that BP has exited the business. Another company that's a slightly newer entrant is called EnviroFit, and they've also sold a lot of stoves. By this point, I think they're actually close to 200,000 stoves, and they tentatively seem to be doing all right. And so now I'm just going to go through a few of the similarities and differences between their business models and talk about how that might affect results. So actually, the biggest difference between the strategies of these companies was in the technology and design choices. The BP folks did these very detailed, almost sort of ethnographic studies where they would send people to villages to live in the village, understand what are the energy needs of the people in the village, and really try to come up with very fundamental new solutions that would help serve these needs. And so one of the things that they heard from people is, hey, we don't just want a better stove. We want a whole cooking solution that incorporates the fuel side, that we always have reliable, affordable fuel, and it's a stove we like, and sort of the whole way through. So BP took a very aggressive approach. Their design actually they created not just a stove supply chain, but a fuel supply chain. So what they do is they take various agricultural waste, it could be nut husk or waste from sugarcane processing, and they basically pulverize it and form it into these little cylinders that is a pretty good fuel that can be burned very efficiently in an advanced stove design, where it actually gasifies the fuel and burns it. So it's low emissions and very efficient. EnviroFit took the total opposite approach. They focused very incrementally on what they could do, very conservative in a sense, but then within what they were doing, being very careful and serious about it. So really they focused principally on, how can we do a stove with better materials and better geometries of combustion that will significantly improve efficiencies and reduce emissions. So simple and complex. And so to spoil the story a little bit, the very thing that's exciting about BP and now First Energy stove also has proved to be their biggest challenge, that they originally thought that, hey, this could be like a Gillette razor model where we sell the stove at a loss and then sell the fuel and make money off the fuel. But they found that it's a heck of a lot harder to make money, make that fuel supply chain viable than it is to make the stove supply chain viable. So we visited last in the spring of this year, and they're really struggling. They've had to increase their prices a lot of the fuel, which has caused the usage to drop off very precipitously. So, and interestingly, well, I'll talk in a minute about what they're doing to deal with this sustainability problem. And that's customer targeting. So this is another aspect of business model. And I would say our broad conclusion on this front was that it's very hard to make money if you're targeting the very poorest of the poor. And this was the experience of almost all of the companies in our sample, that they're targeting, you know, relatively poor people, but not the most destitute. And so this creates, there's a little bit of tension between this idea that, you know, businesses can do well from doing good, and the reality that it's very hard to make money in this space. So one thing that First Energy has actually done, along with several other companies, is they've shifted a bit more to emphasize commercial customers, where because the fuel is not subsidized for commercial customers in India, that's a pretty economic business model, and so they're starting to get some cash flow that can keep their business afloat. But at the same time, they're giving up some of their original goals of really making a difference in a health sense. So another thing that was common between these companies is they both had very generous enterprise financing, which proved to be very important. And they were both very savvy and skillful at developing supply channels. And again, in very similar ways. They both tapped into these networks of self-employed women entrepreneurs, these large groups, and created a bottom level of their supply channel. And then they also created a hierarchical supply channel where there were distributors above them, and they were managed very closely. And then both of them also expanded into storefronts and selling in storefronts. So this ties to the final point that I'll make on this that was, I think, a very interesting conclusion here, is another business model factor is the management and the experience of management and where management comes from. And one finding that really struck us, you know, these are the companies in the sample that had sold some number of stoves. And so this is management experience in person years as in the technology area. So how much have people worked with developing stoves? And then on the y-axis is a log scale of number of stoves distributed. So C and D, those are the two companies I was just talking about. And so interestingly, you know, there's no clear relationship between technology experience and how many stoves have been sold. But there's a very strong relationship for both operational experience and marketing experience with the management experience in those areas and the number of stoves sold. So the upshot is, to make this work, you need a lot of enterprise money, and you need savvy management who will go out and develop a supply channel. And so it's doable, but it's a very difficult business. So I'm just going to end by talking briefly about some research in progress on the other end, from bottom up, where it's looking at household cooking habits. And so this was just our sample. It's in 2 Indian states. We looked at 6 districts in Maharashtra and 4 districts in Karnataka, and collected a bunch of information that we thought would be relevant to consumer choices of which stoves they'd use and how much. So information about the stoves, but also the fuel, the perceptions of health impacts. And then we focused in particular on improved biomass stoves, and especially this Urja stove, where we had the advantage of having data from First Energy on both stove sales and on fuel sales. So the kinds of questions that we wanted to get at, well, one was about what I talked about. How do health factors affect people's stove choices? What kinds of attributes of a stove are most valued by consumers? And, you know, the interaction of demographic factors. So one thing that we hope to do is develop some econometric models of stove choice as a function of demographics, as well as these different stove and fuel characteristics. And then also really look at the diffusion process for an advanced biomass stove. So This is just an example from the field work. On the left, you see a picture of a woman with the traditional stove. And on the right is the grad student I'm working with, Himani Fadke, who's done a great job on this. She's a master's student in international policy studies. And so here she is in a household with an urja. And so I'll just end with two. So these are just very initial results of the kinds of patterns that we're interested in looking at. So one on the bottom, so this traditional chulha is the smoky stove. It's the kind of thing that people really worry about from a health perspective. And so I thought this was just an interesting chart to show. So on the bottom, we have different bins by the percentage of time that households are using chulha. So many of the ones on the far left will be people who are no longer using chulha significantly at all, and the far right is people who are primarily or entirely using chulha. And so you do see that this is partly a function of income. So this chulha bin has roughly half the average income of the bin that's moved away from chulha. And you also see kind of a comparable pattern on education, that the chulha using bin, it tends to be people who are less educated. So the scale on education, 6 is people who have some college. 5 is people who've been through high school. So you can see this is a pretty noticeable demographic difference in who's using chulha and who's moved on perhaps to more modern fuels like LPG. And so this is just a taste of the things, the issues that we're going to explore more deeply with our subsequent analysis of this data. So thank you very much. We welcome questions.
All right, so I think we go till 2:30, but we don't have to. So if you have questions, please ask.
Yes.
In your presentation a while ago, you were talking about the reduction in energy use in California in the last year. A lot of that is related to recession, but how much is related to efficiency gains? Is there a way to measure that?
Well, very glad you asked that question, because one thing that we're looking at as well is that in some other stuff that we have a project looking at the so-called rebound effect. So one of the big things that you have to worry about with energy efficiency investments and improvements is that what people care about is how much does it cost me to use the piece of energy consuming equipment. And so, the simplest example would be television. I mean, television when I was a kid was, right, a little thing that you looked at. Now it's the big, huge, big screen TV. And so what happens is we improve the efficiency of many of these services. People just simply buy more of them. And one of the things that we're doing is we've got we have like household level data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey in the US, the Family Expenditure Survey in the UK, the National NSSO in India, and we're looking at we have people's appliance holdings, people's energy consumption, and one of the things that we find is pretty much the acquisition of these appliances, even though they're becoming more and more efficient. What's happening is people's, if you like, energy consumption in using these appliances that they own is actually, if anything, staying constant or going up. And so, a lot of the energy efficiency, yes, that's reducing the cost of you to doing what you want, but think in the classic case of your car, you drive your car probably more when you've got a 45 mile per gallon car versus when you've got, say, a 10 mile per gallon car. And it looks to see that, at least in the stuff that we've done in the US and the stuff that we've looked at in the UK, it looks like a lot of that is going into the purchase of more of these services simply because of the fact that they're cheaper. So energy efficiency is certainly part of the story in terms of, but the thing that's important to remember is it's just reducing the cost of you buying the thing you want. I mean, we don't eat electricity or gasoline. What we do is we consume the services that a piece of equipment that burns that oil, that gasoline, or consumes that electricity. And if that's cheaper to do, we tend to consume more of it. So, yeah.
There's some money being spent by merchant transmission developers on interstate projects. Do you think those projects are likely to go forward in the next 5 to 7 years?
come to the conference. That's what we're talking about. No, we've got to. That's basically the tension. Is one of the people that we have speaking at the conference is that's basically what he's trying to do is build merchant projects. But there again, it's sort of, thinking from the political economy side of things is that I'm the regulator. I'm used to dealing with the incumbent utility to build my transmission. I don't like you fancy Wall Street guys. You wear coats and ties and, you talk fast. And then the other is that, revenue recovery, certificate of need, all the sorts of stuff. Whereas, my best favorite quote from this person was, just define the rules. We know how to price them. And the thing is, the regulatory side of stuff is saying, yes, but if we change the rules a lot, we're in control. And so, that's the natural tension. And so just to make a long story short, in California, the RPS does allow imported power if it is delivered to California. But if you're an engineer, what does delivering an electron mean if Kirchhoff's laws hold? Well, it's a legal concept. So I can mess with you on the legal side, and so that's the thing that the merchant transmission owners are worried about. Is okay, how will you legally define delivery of renewable power to California is really crucial to whether many of those projects move forward. But I think the point that I tried to make to you guys today is, look, if we're at all serious about hitting the RPS goal in California, and given that the capacity factors you're going to get in a place like Wyoming or Montana are probably 1.5 to 2 times what you're going to get in California, and it's cheaper to build a wind facility in Wyoming than in California, it's a hard thing to argue against. And so, so hopefully, sensible thought will prevail. But that's the purpose of the conference, is to say maybe I'm missing something here, and let's bubble it up. Let's see what it's about.
Anybody else? Oh, sorry.
Well, first of all, what's the state of capacity markets with renewable energy in California, and what do you think the future is of that?
Okay, for the non-electricity techies, capacity markets are essentially what you have to do as a entity in California is show that you have sufficient capacity, generation capacity, iron in the ground, to meet your retail load obligations. Now, the big problem is that's a construct that works great if it's a nuclear power plant, if it's a coal-fired power plant, if it's any dispatchable facility. But this is a big problem with capacity markets, is the fact that capacity markets for a wind facility, what do you value their capacity at? And just to give you an example of how bad this can be, for those of you who may have lived in California for a while, you might remember in 2006, there was essentially a massive heat storm that hit the coast, and California essentially hit a 1 in 50 demand peak. We haven't hit as high a peak demand in California since then. And during that peak demand spell, what we had was less than 3% of the installed wind capacity in the state operating. And so if what you're saying is the capacity that should be put into the capacity market is what is the reliable capacity, 3% for wind kind of, may be the right number. It may not, it may be real low, but that's the fundamental challenge. Whereas for a, fossil fuel facility, it's, look, I've got a 100 megawatt facility. I know I can get the natural gas to burn to turn it on during that really hot period. But with the case of a wind facility, if it's a really hot day, wind typically doesn't blow, which is probably why it's a really hot day. So this is a big challenge. And the short answer to your question is just simply, it's whatever the regulator says it is. And it's whatever the wind guys can come into the PUC and thump the table and talk to their constituents to get that number up as high as possible. But what I'm talking about more of is what should it be in terms of the reliability of delivering power when you need it, and just to show you that it's unfortunately probably a small number.
In ERCOT, it's 8.7%.
Yeah, and that was arrived at in a very scientific manner, I'm sure. Yeah.
A question for Thurber about these low-income markets. When you drew your graph about cooking stoves, I guess we're at the very bottom, how aware these people are of these products, the health ramifications and everything. Are there not more low-hanging fruits that companies can enter where they're helping these people and they are aware of the health benefit, so less barriers to opening up that market.
Yeah, I mean, you mean routes to enter with a product that would improve the indoor smoke issue, but not be as.
In general, it seems like for low-income markets, if you start penetrating at the top, they progressively, become more. You talked about how stoves, they're really not aware of the smoke problem, and I'm talking about different products starting at the top of that list and moving down.
Well, and I think an example here, is if you look, I mean, solar lamps or something where in some sense that's an easier sell, right? Because it's a more tangible, new thing that you're providing, and so, I mean, I think to the extent that the question is, are there other kinds of products that would have benefit that would be lower, that would be easier to do than cook stoves? Definitely. I think that the reason people have been attracted to the cook stoves is it just uniquely has this big health leverage, and so I mean, there are other things with big health leverage too, and two of them were the things that I showed before. I mean, the insecticide treated nets, and the point of use water treatment, and I think if I had to put those on a continuum, I would say the nets are easier, right? Because they're giving some tangible benefits as far as mosquitoes aren't biting me, they're not as expensive. And the cook stoves are probably on the other extreme, and then the water sanitation is also pretty difficult, but maybe somewhere in the middle. But I think people have been attracted to the cook stoves just because the smoke is a big deal. Yeah.
I was just going to say, to follow up on your question, one of the things that we're sort of particularly interested in is that people's attitudes and the information they have about technologies and the like going to influence their willingness to adopt. So maybe people don't know, in Mark's case, the long-term impacts of the smoke they're breathing in. So in a separate area, one of the things for my pet peeve, which is getting people to be more active participants in the sort of managing electricity use, responding to dynamic pricing, we have a number of sort of studies that we're doing with the various utilities around the state where we're saying, look, you can't say, the simple way I would describe it is you go out and you tell people, we're going to give you an interval meter. And it's like the Far Side comic where what you say and what the person hears intrusion into my life, things I hate, And so what we're trying to say is instead, okay, how do we introduce this product in such a way that you're going to see that you're going to get benefits from this? How do we help you to realize these benefits? And so that you will do something that we think has health effects for you, or at least you will make an informed decision not to do that. And I think that's something that I think works here as well. But the thing is that most of what we're doing in the California is having to do with people contacting them through the internet because it's dirt cheap, rather than sending people out to actually talk to them, which is why we're doing them in California with California utilities where people have the internet access.
Well, and on the stoves, related to Frank's point, I mean, both of these companies that did disseminate a lot of stoves, they did not market primarily on a health basis. So it was really, both of them focused their marketing efforts on the aspirational value of stoves that so First Energy, their tagline was as good as LPG. They ran television commercials that showed sort of an attractive, well-off looking couple, and had guests over, and they said, oh, the food is so good, how did you make this? And they brought out this shiny stove, and that, that was effective from what we saw on the ground, because the amazing thing was, when we talked to dealers of these stoves, they said in the heyday of this distribution, First Energy, or then BP, I mean, originally aimed this in rural areas, and the rural dealers got people coming from the city that had seen these ads, and this was the cool new thing, right? And so they, kind of, they went and got it. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and tying into what Frank says, I mean, you need to figure out things that are valued by people, and play to those things, and that's a big part of it.
Question?
On the map that you have on the screen right now, where would you put the cell phone phenomena in India?
Well, so we put, let's see, did we put cell phone? Well, okay, so yeah, I mean, I would go, the way I would tend to characterize cell phones is it's something where the value, most importantly, if you look on the left side, the value to consumers is just obvious, right? I mean, this is a case where you're both from a social perspective, sometimes from an informational perspective, farmers getting information on prices their crops are selling for. So that's the biggest hurdle. And affordability, I mean, they're moderately expensive, but there are ways to make them less expensive. I mean, that's another strategy in selling to low-income populations is you sell, small numbers of minutes, you sell phone cards, you bundle with other services. So I think phones are a much more straightforward thing to do because that's the trouble with a lot of energy products, that what we're asking people to consume, we're not asking them to have a product that offers some radically new service. We're just asking them to do something in many cases which is more environmentally friendly or has other positive benefits. But that's a challenge relative to cell phones or Coke.
I'd be happy to tell you more about cell phones since developing countries, but it's really about price discrimination and legal rules again. So, yeah.
Let's have this be the last
Okay,
one.
sure.
Just building on that, I was selling solar lamps in rural India.
Yeah.
So I would agree that it's easier than stoves,
but not that easy.
We ran into every single problem that you mentioned.
Interesting. Okay.
But did you find a difference between push products and pull products? Right, because the cell phones have become a need, a want.
Yeah.
Right? People are coming up to the retail store and asking for them.
Yeah.
Nobody comes to the retail store and says, "I want a pickle."
Well, I think that's exactly. That's exactly what the distinction is. I think that's most fundamental. That if you think over here about perceived value, something people get it, that's a pull product, right? And I think that's a great way to say it. Cookstoves for 30 years have been a push product, and pushed mainly by people outside the country, right? And who are very well intentioned, but it hasn't worked very well so far. So.
Okay. Well, by the order of the boss, we'll stop here. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.